The date is December 1997. In a boardroom in Cupertino, California, the air is so thick with tension it is nearly unbreathable. Michael Dell, the founder of Dell Computers, is asked publicly what he would do if he were in charge of Apple Computer. His response is cold, calculated, and devastatingly precise. "ID shut it down and give the money back to the shareholders." He wasn't being cruel. He was looking at the math. At that specific moment, Apple was losing over $1 billion a year. Their share price was trading at less than $1 when adjusted for splits. They had no viable operating system, a confused product line of over a dozen beige boxes that nobody wanted, and, most critically, the company had roughly 90 days of cash left in the bank before total insolvency. 90 days. The titan of Silicon Valley, the company that had ignited the personal computer revolution, was effectively dead on arrival. Fast forward to January 3rd, 2022. That same company becomes the first in human history to hit a market capitalization of $3 trillion. That is a number so large it exceeds the GDP of the United Kingdom, India, or France. If Apple were a country, it would be the fifth largest economy on Earth. This is not just a story of a corporate turnaround. It is the single greatest reversal of fortune in the history of modern capitalism. If you want to understand how empires are built, destroyed, and resurrected, make sure you are subscribed to Market Legends. We decode the financial history that shapes our world. To understand the $3 trillion peak, we must understand the basement, or rather, the garage. The mythology of Apple often glosses over the sheer improbability of its survival in the 1970s. When Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak founded Apple Computer in 1976, the concept of a personal computer was an oxymoron. Computers were room-sized machines owned by governments and universities. Wozniak, the engineering genius, wasn't trying to change the world. He simply wanted to impress his friends at the Homebrew Computer Club. He built the Apple I by hand, a naked circuit board that lacked a case, a keyboard, or a screen. It was Jobs who saw the commerce in the chaos. He didn't see a hobbyist's toy. He saw an appliance. This fundamental divergence, engineering for engineers versus engineering for humans, would become the DNA of the company. Their first major success, the Apple II, launched in 1977, was a lightning strike. It was one of the first computers that looked like it belonged in a home rather than a laboratory. It had color graphics, a plastic case, and it ran VisiCalc, the world's first spreadsheet program. Suddenly, the computer wasn't just a toy, it was a business tool. Apple went public in December 1980. It was the biggest IPO since Ford Motor Company in 1956. Overnight, Jobs and Wozniak were worth hundreds of millions. Apple created more millionaires in a single day than any company in history up to that point. But this instant wealth masked a rotting foundation. The Apple II was generating all the cash, but it was aging technology. The company needed a successor. The early 1980s saw Apple fracture into warring tribes. On one side was the Lisa project, a high-end, extremely expensive business computer named after Jobs' daughter. On the other was the Macintosh project, a rogue team Jobs took over after being kicked off the Lisa team. Jobs raised a pirate flag over the Macintosh building. He pushed his engineers to the breaking point, demanding aesthetic perfection on circuit boards that no user would ever see. The Macintosh, released in 1984 with the famous Ridley Scott commercial, was a technical marvel. It introduced the world to the graphical user interface, GUI, and the mouse. It spoke to users. It smiled when it booted up, but it was underpowered and overpriced. Sales started strong, but plummeted quickly. Meanwhile, the industry had shifted. IBM had entered the market. The IBM PC was clunky and ugly, but it was open. Anyone could clone it. Microsoft, led by a young Bill Gates, was licensing its operating system to every clone manufacturer in existence. The market was being flooded with cheap, compatible PCs, while Apple stood alone in its walled garden, expensive and incompatible. The tension between art and commerce came to a head in 1985. John Sculley, the CEO whom Jobs had recruited from Pepsi with the famous line, "Do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life? Or do you want to come with me and change the world?" turned on his recruiter. The board of directors sided with Sculley. In a Shakespearean betrayal, Steve Jobs was stripped of all operational duties. He resigned, sold all but one of his shares, and left the company he founded. For the next decade, Apple drifted. This era, often referred to as the Beige Age, was characterized by a profound lack of focus. Without Jobs' maniacal product vision, Apple tried to be everything to everyone. They released printers, scanners, portable CD players, and the Newton, a personal digital assistant that was visionary but technically flawed. The product line became a labyrinth of confusion. There were the Quadra, the Centris, the Performa, the LC, and the PowerBook. A customer walking into a store had no idea which computer to buy. The models were nearly identical, separated only by minor confusing specifications. Apple was competing on volume and price against Microsoft and Intel, a war they could not win because they refused to license their operating system. They were a hardware company in a software world. By 1996, the situation was catastrophic. Windows 95 had just launched, offering a user experience that was good enough for 95% of the world at half the price of a Mac. Apple's own operating system, System 7, was ancient, crashing constantly and unable to multitask effectively. They desperately needed a modern OS, but their internal development project, Copeland, was a disaster of buggy code that was years behind schedule. Apple was a ship taking on water, and the sharks were circling. Sun Microsystems, Oracle, and IBM all considered buying the carcass of Apple for pennies on the dollar. The CEO at the time, Gil Amelio, made a desperate Hail Mary pass. He decided Apple needed to buy an operating system from the outside. The choice came down to two companies. One was BEOS, created by former Apple executive Jean-Louis Gasset. It was modern, fast, and flashy. The other was Next, the company Steve Jobs had founded after his exile. Next had struggled to sell hardware, but its software, Next Step, was bulletproof, built on a robust Unix foundation. In December 1996, Apple announced it would acquire Next for $429 million. But they weren't just buying software. They were buying the founder. Steve Jobs was back. He returned to a company that was arguably in worse shape than he had left it. The culture was toxic. Employees were demoralized, rich from early stock options, but producing nothing of value. The campus was filled with projects that had no deadline and no purpose. Jobs was initially brought in as an advisor, but the coup was swift. He convinced the board that Amelio was incapable of saving the ship. In July 1997, Amelio was ousted, and Jobs was named interim CEO or ICO. Jobs didn't start by launching a new product. He started by swinging an axe. He looked at the product roadmap, that confusing mess of performas and quadras, and drew a simple 2x2 grid on a whiteboard. He labeled the columns Consumer and Pro, and the rows Desktop and Portable. He told his stunned executives that Apple would kill 70% of its hardware projects immediately. If a product didn't fit into one of those four quadrants, it was gone. Thousands of employees were laid off. Entire divisions were shuttered. The Newton was killed. The printers were killed. The servers were killed. He stopped the licensing program that allowed other companies to make Mac clones, effectively cutting off a revenue stream to save the brand's exclusivity. It was a bloodbath, but it stopped the bleeding. Jobs' philosophy was radical focus. He believed that Apple should not make the most computers. It should make the best computers. But cutting costs doesn't save a company. Only revenue does. And for revenue, Apple needed a hit. They needed something that didn't look like a beige box. Deep in the design lab, a young British designer named Johnny Ive was frustrated. He had been planning to quit, tired of the company's lack of care for design. Jobs discovered Ive's prototypes and realized he had found his spiritual partner. Together, they began working on a computer that would inhabit the consumer desktop quadrant of the grid. But before they could launch it, they had to survive the fiscal year. The bank account was still running dry. Jobs knew he needed a lifeline, a signal to the market that Apple was not going bankrupt. He made a phone call that would shock the world. The audience at the 1997 Macworld Expo booed. They jeered. On the screen above them was the face of the enemy, Bill Gates. Steve Jobs stood on stage and announced a partnership. Microsoft would invest $150 million in Apple and commit to developing Office for the Mac for 5 years. In exchange, Apple would drop a long-standing lawsuit against Microsoft and make Internet Explorer the default browser on the Mac. To the Apple faithful, it felt like a surrender. To Wall Street, it was salvation. The cash injection and the vote of confidence from the world's most successful software company stabilized the stock. It bought Jobs the one thing he needed most: time. Time to finish the computer that Johnny Ive was polishing in the lab. In 1998, Apple unveiled the iMac G3. It was shocking. It was translucent. It was Bondi blue. It was curvy. It had a handle on top, not because you would carry it, but because Jobs wanted you to feel comfortable touching it. It had no floppy drive, a decision critics called suicide. Instead, it focused on the internet, the I in iMac. It was a sensation. People who had never owned a computer bought one just because of how it looked in their living room. Apple sold 800,000 units in the first 5 months. The company returned to profitability. The immediate crisis was over, but Jobs wasn't interested in just selling computers anymore. He was looking at the digital lifestyle. He looked at the music industry and saw chaos. Napster was allowing people to steal music because buying it digitally was impossible. MP3 players existed, but they were clunky, held only a few songs, and had terrible battery life. Jobs realized that the Mac could be the digital hub for your life, but he needed a device to tether to it. In October 2001, weeks after the dot-com bubble burst and the world was reeling from the 9/11 attacks, Apple invited the press to a small town hall event. Jobs pulled a small, white, stainless steel device from the coin pocket of his jeans. 1,000 songs in your pocket, he said. The iPod was not the first MP3 player, but it was the first one that mattered. It had a scroll wheel that made navigating thousands of songs intuitive. It synced seamlessly with iTunes. It was beautiful. Critics mocked the price tag, $3.99, but consumers didn't care. The iPod became a cultural icon. It turned Apple from a computer company into a consumer electronics powerhouse. But the iPod did something even more important. It taught Apple how to manufacture at scale. It taught them how to manage a massive global supply chain. It taught them how to sell a luxury experience to the mass market. The iPod eventually captured over 70% of the digital music player market. By 2006, the iPod was generating half of Apple's revenue. The company had fully transformed. Yet, Steve Jobs was paranoid. He looked at the mobile phone market and saw a threat. He knew that eventually, cell phones would become smart enough to play music. If a consumer could carry one device that made calls and played music, they would stop buying iPods. The device that was saving Apple was destined to die. Jobs decided that if anyone was going to kill the iPod, it should be Apple. The development of the iPhone was an ordeal of unprecedented secrecy and technical difficulty. The team, codenamed Project Purple, had to invent an entirely new interface. Physical keyboards were the industry standard. BlackBerry dominated the professional world. Jobs insisted on a screen made entirely of glass, with a multi-touch interface that allowed users to tap, pinch, and swipe. The risks were astronomical. Apple had zero experience in the telecom industry. They had to convince a carrier to give them control over the phone's design and software, something no carrier had ever done. Jobs managed to strike a deal with Singular, later AT&T, by sheer force of will. The room is silent, waiting for the punchline. Jobs repeats the phrase, an iPod, a phone, and an internet communicator. He repeats it again. An iPod, a phone, are you getting it? These are not 3 separate devices. This is one device, and we are calling it iPhone. When the iPhone launched in June 2007, the competitors laughed. Steve Ballmer, the CEO of Microsoft, famously said, "There's no chance that the iPhone is going to get any significant market share. No chance. It's a $500 subsidized item." He wasn't alone in his skepticism. The BlackBerry executives looked at the iPhone's battery life and lack of a keyboard and deemed it a toy for teenagers, not a tool for serious business. They missed the point entirely. The iPhone wasn't just a phone. It was a pocket computer that happened to make calls. It was the first device to put the real internet, not a watered-down mobile version, into your pocket. It was a platform. Initially, Jobs was resistant to allowing third-party apps on the iPhone, fearing they would mess up the phone's performance or infect it with viruses. But the pressure from developers and his own team was immense. In 2008, Apple launched the App Store. This was the moment the ecosystem was truly born. Suddenly, the iPhone wasn't just defined by what Apple built. It was defined by what the world built for it. The app economy created a new gold rush, and Apple took a 30% cut of every transaction. By 2010, Apple was firing on all cylinders. They launched the iPad, creating the tablet market overnight after Microsoft had failed at it for a decade. The iPad was mocked as just a big iPhone, but it sold 3 million units in 80 days. Apple was no longer just surviving, it was dominating. But tragedy was looming. Steve Jobs, the visionary who had resurrected the company, had been fighting a private battle with pancreatic cancer. On August 24, 2011, he resigned as CEO. On October 5, 2011, one day after the launch of the iPhone 4S, Steve Jobs passed away. The world mourned, but Wall Street worried. The common consensus was that Apple died with Steve Jobs. The company was now in the hands of Tim Cook, the chief operating officer. Cook was not a product visionary. He was a supply chain expert, a spreadsheet guy, a quiet, reserved Southerner who lacked Jobs' reality distortion field. The narrative was written. The fall of Apple Part 2 was inevitable. Without the magician, the magic would fade. And for a while, it seemed the critics might be right. The pace of revolutionary, new product categories slowed down. There were no more lightning strikes like the iPhone or iPad every 2 years. The stock price stagnated. People complained that Apple had lost its ability to innovate. But while the world was looking for magic tricks, Tim Cook was building a fortress. What the critics failed to understand was that Steve Jobs had built the products, but Tim Cook had built the machine that made the products. Cook is an operational genius of the highest order. When he joined Apple in 1998, the company held months of inventory, costing them millions in storage and depreciation. Cook slashed that down. At one point, Apple's inventory turnover was so efficient that the company held only a few days of inventory. In the world of manufacturing, inventory is evil. It's cash sitting on a shelf rotting. Cook turned Apple's manufacturing into a lean, mean, cash-generating engine. Under Cook, Apple's strategy shifted. He recognized that the smartphone market would eventually saturate. Everyone who wanted an iPhone would eventually have one. The growth couldn't come just from selling more units. It had to come from extracting more value from each user and locking them into the ecosystem. This was the pivot to services. Cook looked at the billion active iPhones in the world not just as hardware sales, but as a distribution network. iCloud, Apple Music, Apple Pay, Apple TV Plus, Apple Arcade, Apple News Plus. Each of these was a recurring revenue stream. In 2010, Apple's services revenue was negligible. By 2023, the services division alone was generating over $85 billion a year, more than the total revenue of Fortune 50 companies like Boeing or Intel. Cook also quietly revolutionized the hardware. He oversaw the introduction of the Apple Watch in 2015. It was an instant hit like the iPhone. The first version was slow and unfocused, but Apple iterated. They focused on health and fitness. Today, the Apple Watch business alone is larger than the entire Swiss watch industry combined. Then came the AirPods in 2016. Mocked for looking like toothbrush heads, they became a cultural phenomenon and a multi-billion-dollar business in their own right. These wearables did something crucial. They increased the switching costs. If you have an iPhone, an Apple Watch, and AirPods, switching to Android becomes a painful, expensive headache. This is the walled garden strategy executed to perfection. Financially, Cook engineered the greatest capital return program in history. As Apple's cash pile grew to over $200 billion, money they literally couldn't spend fast enough, Cook began buying back Apple stock. By reducing the number of shares available, he increased the value of the remaining shares. It was a masterclass in financial engineering that drove the stock price vertically, even when revenue growth slowed. In August 2018, Apple became the first U.S. company to hit a $1 trillion market cap. It had taken 42 years to get there. Just 2 years later, in August 2020, amidst a global pandemic where the world went digital, Apple hit $2 trillion. The demand for iPads and Macs surged as the world worked from home. And then, the peak. On January 3, 2022, Apple broke the $3 trillion barrier. To put that in perspective, Apple generated more profit in a single quarter than Amazon has generated in its entire lifetime combined. This journey from near bankruptcy to $3 trillion is not just about one man. It is the story of two distinct eras. The Jobs era was about the 0 to 1 foot, the creation of things that didn't exist. It was volatile, artistic, and risky. The Cook era was about the 1 to 1 billion foot, scaling that vision to every corner of the globe with ruthless efficiency and consistency. The fall of Apple in the 90s happened because they forgot who they were. They tried to play by everyone else's rules. The rebirth happened because they stopped looking at the competition and started looking at the user experience. They integrated hardware, software, and services in a way that no other company has ever managed to replicate. Today, Apple faces new challenges. Antitrust regulators in the US and EU are attacking the walled garden. The smartphone market is mature. The reliance on China for manufacturing is a geopolitical risk. And the next big thing, whether it's augmented reality with the Vision Pro or an Apple car, remains an expensive gamble. But if history has taught us anything, it is that betting against Apple is a dangerous game. From a garage in Los Altos to the brink of death, and finally to the mountaintop of the global economy, Apple has proven that it can reinvent itself when it matters most. The legend of Apple is not just about the devices in our pockets. It's about the resilience of an idea, that technology, when designed with humanity in mind, can change the world and make $3 trillion along the way. If you enjoyed this deep dive into financial history, help us outsmart the algorithm. Subscribe to Market Legends right now for more stories of the companies that rule our world.